freedom of media and protection of journalists in the Middle East. And we have the pleasure to welcome Mrs. Barbara Triomfi from the International Press Institute, Mr. Adam White, Director Ethical Journalism Network, and Mrs. Hussain, who will react to the speeches and answer the questions. She comes from the, yes, she was Al Jazeera. She is Al Jazeera journalist, but also in jail, so with a lot of experience. And Mr. Fattorini, we hope he will join us as soon as he can. On a du son là. Okay, so before to give you the floor, I would ask to sign our golden book.
Yeah.
That's a huge signature.
Yeah.
Just a signature.
Just
yes.
a little message to, keep them happy.
You can also sit on the front. You will be better to ask questions, so you can join us at the front line. Thanks. And so I would now like to give the floor to Mrs. Triomfi for the opening remarks, and after Mr. White will follow. So please. Just push the button.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for having us here today to talk about a topic that certainly has been of concern to many of us, related to journalism in the Middle East, the difficulties that journalists face in doing their work throughout the Middle East, certainly. And I'm so glad and honored to have on my left Ms. Hussain, who is the daughter of a very well-known journalist, Mahmoud Hussain, who has been in prison for, I believe, over 2 years now. 440 days. So I'll also look forward to hearing more from her about the fate of her father in Egypt. Just maybe as a mean of introduction to the overall topic. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Executive Director of the International Press Institute, which is a global network of editors, journalists, and media executives dedicated equally to the promotion of a free press and the promotion of good journalism, of quality journalism, of a journalism that serves the interests of society, which can only be carried out if the press enjoys the freedoms it has the right to. Certainly looking at the Middle East as one of the most challenging regions where IPI works in terms of the diverse and yet the immense challenges that every single country in the Middle East faces. Middle East and North Africa, I would add. We are, and unfortunately, things have been getting worse. So over the past few years, as a consequence of geopolitics, and I look forward to also discussing with people in the room and with my fellow panelists, so to try and understand what brought us here today and how can we overturn this trend. We are looking, I would say we're looking at two types of general trends. First of all, safety of journalists, countries where a large number of journalists are attacked, are killed every year, just in the attempt to do their work. And unfortunately, in many of these countries, and I'm sure, I mean, typically Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Bahrain has been the case as well. is not only journalists who cover a conflict and are caught in the crossfire, is increasingly journalists who are targeted because of what they do, because of what they write, because of their function really in society. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, IPI collects numbers of journalists killed every year. I'm looking at 2015, out of 115 journalists killed all over the world, 51 were in the Middle East, in particular in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. In 2016, out of 120 journalists, 41 were killed in the Middle East, Bahrain, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. And in 2017, out of the 82 journalists killed, 23 were killed in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So these are very large figures. And maybe two things to say about this. First of all, safety is an issue that we discuss a lot among our members, and the general comment that a lot of our members make, also looking at safety and looking at trends and why journalists continue to be attacked, and increasingly so are, they also link that to the crisis of trust in journalism and in the profession, because of a number of reasons that I'm sure Aidan White will go more into details about the declining trust in the media, very often also generated by incitement by government and political figures. Because of this, journalists do not enjoy that perception of being the neutral observers, or at least the observers that they used to enjoy. And many of our members who have covered numerous conflicts, they said, 20 years ago, we used to go into a conflict situation and we knew the people would always protect us. I don't know how many times the people would welcome us in their houses because we were the journalists. This is not the case today anymore. Journalists there, and journalists are being kidnapped, are being very often simply because of the type of equipment they have with them, but also they're being killed in order to be silenced. The second trend, besides of safety, is that we see in other countries across the Middle East are state restrictions, state-imposed restrictions to limit the ability of journalists and journalism to disseminate independent, or at least different opinions and ideas and information. Just to give you a few countries, certainly Aya will talk more about Egypt. Today we are talking about dozens of journalists imprisoned in Egypt, and the difficulty of accessing information from within the country is such that even at IPI, in spite of a thorough research, we don't know the exact number. Or everybody has a different number, because it is so difficult to get the right information out because of the level of restrictions that human rights groups, press freedom groups, and journalists face within the country. But numbers vary between 25 and 40, according to the source. Bahrain, a country that up until 2011 used to be, if you want, one of the more liberal ones in the Middle East, a country where critical opinion could be expressed. After 2011, the clampdown on dissent, the clampdown on opposition figures, but also on critical journalism, has been immense through arrest, legal measure, basically the use of all sorts of laws to silence journalists. And then we Saudi Arabia, typically a country that also recently has been projecting an image of itself as becoming more open. And what we monitor in terms of the journalistic freedoms and the ability of journalists to work is not going in that direction. Again, journalists receive lengthy prison sentences, and on top of all this, in all these countries also we have seen a clampdown on social media, on digital, on online, on the ability of journalists to also operate through online channels to disseminate information. So, as I said, why these developments? There are geopolitical reasons we can look at. There are many a possibility to analyze this, and many analyses have been put forward. What we see, and that is what is concerning a lot the International Press Institute, our members, and those people who believe that free journalism is still what is keeping our societies together and what is protecting our democracies, is a perception that neither the international community nor very often the people in the countries, in some cases, or a majority of the people in the country, care for the values that have been so dear to the press freedom community, and also being in Geneva to the old system of international organization that we have developed, the UN system and other international organizations. So again, how can we change that trend? How can we ensure that people understand that journalism has a function and that journalism is not about whatever it is accused of? And how can we ensure that people are willing to stand up and fight for the ability of journalists to carry out their work, not only in their own countries, but also in the neighboring countries? How can we make sure that people across Europe care about what is going on in Egypt, a country where, and as I said, I will talk more about this, journalists have been sitting in prison for years without being brought in front of a court, without, in very many cases, the charges are unclear, there are unclear indictment, there isn't any rule of law process going on, and that is depressing, is causing and silencing not only those journalists that are in prison, but everybody else who is also outside and is fearing similar fate. But I think that I can talk about this in a much better way. So I leave it to you. Thank you.
Is it on? Is it clear? Okay. So I'm not going to talk about the situation in Egypt in general, but the situation me and my family and my father are going through. It's a very personal case for me. Okay, is it clear now? So in the case of my father, him being a journalist, it was portrayed as an act of, as a criminal act, as an act of him spying on his country, him being a terrorist. And I was surprised to see the Egyptian media where journalists have made an ugly campaign on a man that was their colleague for more than 25 years, accusing him of being a terrorist, of being a spy, of being a traitor of his country. In the case of my dad, the only reason why he is in prison is that he is a journalist, that he works for a news channel that the country isn't really pleased with its performance. So what happened with my dad? So my dad has been subjected, was and is still subjected to many violations that has affected his life, our life, and his humanity. My dad was, so his house and the houses of the rest of the family, our uncles and our aunts have been stormed, properties have been destroyed. My dad was, I can't say anything other than kidnapped, because he and two of my uncles disappeared for 11 days. My dad, he was in an unknown place for 11 days. He didn't know where he was. He was blindfolded, stripped naked, handcuffed. That was before his official transfer to the prison. And as you see here, this is a case where he's not even being treated as a citizen that has any sort of rights. And interestingly, the media, so the authorities in Egypt have recorded what they call confessions of my dad and portrayed it on a national TV in a time that we didn't know where he was, his lawyers didn't know where he was, so it was like they are giving him a sort of a public judgment that he cannot control and we cannot control. And for the case of my dad, my father has been put in solitary confinement for more than 100 days, which is a cruel punishment that actually led to a lot of psychological distress to him. In the very early days, I remember when my sister used to visit him, she used to mention that he started to forget things, he started to confuse facts, he was just, it was a torturing thing that they are doing to him. So in this case, you're seeing the authorities treating a journalist. It's not even as a criminal. Even a criminal does not deserve to be treated that way. If he has charges, if he made something wrong, okay, fine, just put him in front of a judge, give him a fair trial, and if he did something wrong, let him pay for it in a legal way. But for now, it's been more than 440 days, and my dad has absolutely zero charges. We don't know if there are charges that are undeclared or there's no charges at all. It's been more than 1 year that my dad hasn't been under any investigation, so it's just like he's there just forgotten. In that sense, it's a sort of a punishment for him for being, although in that time he wasn't really going home to report, he was just going home for a vacation. So I can't really describe the pain that our family has been through, and what we feel for our dad, especially that in last summer his arm was broken in the prison and he was denied medical treatment. So whenever I talk to the international community, it hurts me because Egypt should take care of its citizen. Him being a good Egyptian citizen is enough for him to be released. I shouldn't reach out for the international community to call on his release. That does not just make any sense for me.
Okay, thanks. Mr. White, yes?
Yeah, I wonder if I can make a... I want to make a little presentation if I can. First of all, I mean, I think what you've said is really, I mean, it's very moving, and I really understand it. When a member of your family is treated in such a way. But there's something terrible that's happened, which is that your father has become a victim of a sort of terrible change that's taken place in terms of obligations that states have to preserve the right to justice, the right, respect for human rights for individuals. And instead now we see it being sacrifices. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. And so we see a sort of terrible change that's taken place. And the question is, and Barbara posing it, is that what has happened? Why are we living now in an age where this sort of injustice takes place routinely, where the international community remains silent, where we have journalism, the best of journalism, no longer regarded with trust, where whole communities now are calling into question institutions of democracy, academic systems, media systems, systems of government, a lack of trust in democratic parties, the notion of people having some control over their lives. What has happened? And I think that we have a massive problem because we live in an age where we have more communication than at any time in human history, more capacity to talk to one another and share with one another experiences, but we live in an age where there is more distrust, more fear, more uncertainty, and unquestionably more ignorance about what is happening. So I just wanted to briefly, if I can, really to attack some of this, try to answer some of the questions, and actually it's a very bleak time, but maybe even try to sort of find some potential solutions, and it's very difficult. And why I feel it's particularly bleak is that it's only 7 years ago that we had the Arab Spring, and we always remember how fantastically optimistic was the feeling of the change that was coming at that time. But that has been snuffed out. And so we have to sort of look, why has that happened, and so on. And in a way, your father is tragically a victim of that process. Now, this organization, which Ethical Journalism Network was set up 5 or 6 years ago now, And it was set up because of a recognition that there is a crisis in terms of information, and a number of professional groups got together to try to strengthen journalism, because they identified that journalism itself was something that needed to be protected and nourished and strengthened, because it provides an answer to a lot of the problems that we've been talking about right now. And one of the key issues that we identified straight away, so this organization, we've got about 60 odd international organizations in membership. We focus on three things: ethical journalism, good governance, and self-regulation. That's all we do. Safety of journalists is very important. Lots of good work is being done on it, but we think that not enough work is being done on questions related to content and safety. And this is one of the problems that we immediately identified. The role of media as hate mongers and warmongers is absolutely a major problem. And we launched a campaign in 2014 called Turning the Page of Hate, which was at the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, in which media played an absolutely shocking role in organized slaughter of up to 800,000 people, in which media were helping to orchestrate that. And we realized that the power of media, therefore, has to be mobilized in a completely different way. And we don't find that's happening. So we find today war propaganda at work in the Middle East and Europe as much as, and so on. So we have tried to develop a campaign which focuses on the Middle East and in Africa. And it seems to me, and it seems to us, it's really essential that we try to find ways of dealing with it. The problem about hatred and hate speech is that, and we see it, it's in the Middle East a crucible for the question of bias and hatred. And these issues, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, genocide, religion, race relations, migration, gender equality, all of them contain within them the sort of seeds of a sort of capacity for hatred. I mean, and in which media, unfortunately, are implicated. So, but it's not just a sort of, again, a technical question. One of the things I think Barbara was hinting at, and I think we have to address, is that we are in the midst of a really significant global crisis of information. And it's not just a question of, is this fake news? Is that not fake news? No. We're talking about the generation of propaganda and warmongering through using media in such a way that is absolutely today having a dramatic effect on people's lives. In Russia, in Ukraine, in the Balkans, there are media wars taking place today. In the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, there are media wars taking place today. China, Japan, and Korea, there's propaganda, nationalism, media being instrumentalized today. In Africa, Burundi, Somali, and Egypt, media being instrumentalized. So this is a massive sort of a problem. In the Middle East in particular, we've looked at Arab journalism, particularly in the firing line. In Palestine, there was a report just a couple of days ago by Hamla, which is a Haifa-based monitoring organization, which found that every 17 minutes there is a post which is anti-Palestinian in Israeli media. That, you know, the massive amount of hatred is being generated. That groups like Facebook are not doing enough to take it down, and so on and so forth. In the Yemen, journalism has become a victim of regional conflict. The Yemen is a forgotten conflict, but actually in the Yemen, hundreds of thousands of people have suffered and journalists have suffered terribly and so on. It's barely reported, the reality of it. In Syria, journalists in exile are actually trying to sort of combat a sort of terrible situation there. In Egypt, now, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about Egypt because actually there are reasons to be cheerful. That's a strange thing to say after what you said, but I think in Egypt there are things that we could be thinking about. But self-censorship and victimization of independent journalists like Mahmoud Hussein are absolutely happening all the time. So that's the problem. But why did we lose the Arab Spring? Sectarianism and terrorism has been used and instrumentalized in information to stifle the voices of reform and has fatally wounded the Arab Spring. So we have these sorts of problems. So when we're looking for answers, we have to sort of think, what in practical terms can we do? And that's what we try to do, is to try to come up with ways of dealing with the major crisis. So what do journalists need? Journalists and journalism need support. They need more recognition. Their status needs to be enhanced. They need more tools. They need more help in implementing codes of conduct. We are developing glossaries against hate speech. We've done it in Egypt. We've worked with universities in Egypt, journalists in Egypt. We've produced a glossary of hate speech, the first glossary of hate speech in the Arab world. And we're now sort of going on to try to do it in other. So even in the darkest areas, there are journalists willing to work together. And that gets us to this question of solidarity. One of the biggest and most critical problems facing journalism everywhere around the world is a lack of solidarity. Journalists are divided. Journalists are recruited and they are instrumentalized for one side or another in a conflict, for one group or another in a national political situation. So how do we build new forms of solidarity? Actually, there are signs that things are beginning to change. We're working with small country, Cyprus, on the journalists on the north and south of this divided island, which has been divided for 40 years. These journalists have come together to work against hate speech. It's the first time that there's practical action in which journalists are defending these issues. Egypt, I've said, things are coming together. In Syria, journalists in exile in Turkey and elsewhere are now sitting down, working on codes of conduct, working with others to try to build something together. And they're getting support in Turkey, which I've just got back from. A terrible country, suffering at the moment, where hundreds, 150 journalists are in jail. And we are constantly, and Barbara's organization has been among the leaders of this, constantly fighting injustice and the use of law against journalism. They are now, media are coming together in a heavily divided area. So this question of solidarity and how we build solidarity is absolutely essential to this process. Training and raising awareness on the threats of propaganda, terrorism, and warmongering. One of the problems about meetings like this is that it's very easy to be demoralized by what we say to one another. It's very easy for us to say, look, we're powerless. What the hell can we do to try to sort of deal with this? Actually, there are small things we can do. And those small things that we do help to sustain journalists. They give journalists confidence. They allow them to think that maybe they can make a difference. And it's our business, it seems to me, in the international community to try to build the confidence of journalists, at least to work together. Maybe they have to accept self-censorship. Yeah, in Egypt, if you want to survive, you have to. In Turkey, if you want to survive, you have to censor yourself. But at the same time, there's no reason why you have to crush altogether the spirit of journalism and what journalism is about and so on. So building journalism, building support for journalism, you know, challenging where we can political centers of power is all part of the process. So one of the things we have to do is to understand the role of journalists as informed witnesses in society, where there are wars, where there are conflicts and so on. And we have to build that confidence and we have to build that professionalism. The problem about it is this, and this is one of the reasons why, and Barbara's point is this, is that we see a massive political shift in which technology and the controls of information are now in the hands of powerful people who are ruthless in the use of information in order to divide communities, to promote racism, to promote hatreds and so on. You can never have a discussion like this without having Donald Trump on it in some way. But actually, he is merely only one sort of representative. You look around the world, Al-Sisi, Erdogan, in Europe, Orban, Putin. You know, look at these populists, these people with real power. They are leading a political initiative which is against the notion of free, independent, and ethical communications and propagandizing. So this is a massive sort of question for us, that political challenge. And here is really why I think we have to just really say, look, journalism as a stream of information, there are about 400 codes of conduct that exist around the world for journalism. And some of them are very short, some of them are very long, but actually when they all boil down to these 5 principles. You go to anywhere in the world and you talk to journalists and they will boil down to these principles. The 5 simple principles of journalism. 1, fact-based, accuracy and fact-based information. 2, independence. You're not a propagandist or a public relations person. 3, impartiality. You have to be inclusive when you tell your stories. You have to tell all sides of a story. 4thly, and perhaps the most important ethic of journalism, is the ethic of humanity, that we don't do damage. We don't single out and target people. We don't tell malicious lies. We don't target communities because they have a different religion or they have a different color of their skin and so on. So, and fifthly is the question of transparency. Journalists are supposed to say sorry when they make mistakes. They're not very good at it, but that's what they're supposed to do. So these core values underpin the possibility of rebuilding trust. If we can find ways in which the community or the society at large can focus on supporting journalism which can deliver these sorts of principles, then I think we can look forward to things. And one of the things we've done is we've developed, for instance, in dealing with hate speech, a 5-point test for hate speech which tries to help journalists identify really what makes hate speech. The problem about hate speech is that nobody has got a really good definition of it, and the international definition of hate speech is really most unsatisfactory because it just says hate speech is anything that generates intense hatred or incitement to violence. Well, actually, that differs interpretation in different countries. So we've tried to develop a practical tool which journalists can use to try to identify hate speech and so on, and that's the sort of thing that we are trying to do. And I think the work that Al Jazeera does and the Human Rights and Civil Liberties Desk, it seems to me is absolutely essential in trying to raise awareness about these sorts of issues: the attention of the speech, the content and form of the speech, the reach of the speech, the position and status of the speaker. You know, all of these are really important. How does a journalist judge, you know, what makes hatred and so on? So these are really practical things, and, you know, we've developed questions that journalists should ask themselves about hatred and so on. And we've really focused as well on perhaps the most important thing is about creating an environment in which journalists can make hard decisions about what to publish and what not to publish. This is a very famous picture taken by a journalist, very violent, full of hatred, very absolutely devastatingly in terms of humanity. If you look closely at the man's head, you can see the bullet emerging from the top of his head. It's almost a picture of the moment of death that you're likely to get. Should that be published? Should that be a picture that's published? Who would decide that? Here's another picture. Here's a picture of horror, terror, again the same sort of epoch and so on. It's a picture of a young woman in terror. Should we publish that picture? How do we use that? Well, actually, who decides? This picture was censored by Facebook. It was censored by a Facebook algorithm which said, it's nudity, it's a child, therefore it breaks the rules. And when the Prime Minister of Norway kept putting the picture back up on her Facebook page, the algorithm kept taking it down. And these two pictures, in a way, show that in order to decide whether or not to publish, you need nuanced understanding by morally aware journalists to be able to take those decisions. And you have to create the environment where they can make those decisions. So you need journalists, and robotics are important, but in the end you need journalists who are ethically aware. So this is really what we try to do, and this sums up, I think, one of the problems we have. Those previous two pictures were pictures taken by journalists. This is not a picture taken by a journalist. This picture has no violence in it. This picture is a beautiful picture. Any picture editor would look at this picture and say, it's beautiful. Beautiful contrasting colors, strong images, Guantanamo orange, strong black figure, forceful, powerful, and so on. It is a perfect picture, which is why all the journalists used it. And yet it was produced by a propaganda unit of a terrorist organization deliberately to create fear. So this is hate speech. Doesn't look like hate speech, but this is hate speech. So why do we use it, and how do we use it, and why, and how do we create the confidence of journalists to be able to take the judgment about whether to use it or not? So all of this, finally, I just sort of think, you know, we need, in responding to this crisis in Egypt, in responding to the crisis that's been identified by Barbara, we need to find a way in which we can work together to strengthen journalism. And that's not about strengthening just any media organization. I'm really actually cheered to be in Geneva this week, because it was really good news when I saw that in Geneva the referendum reinforced public broadcasting. It seemed to me that it's really, really important that to actually have the reinforcing of public broadcasting by the public at large seemed to me to be a notion of building of public trust existing and how we can build on it if we have good open journalism and so on. So promoting responsible communications and to focus on political, corporate and civil centres of power for change, and to build respect for self-restraint and ethical values in social networks. Those are the sorts of things we can try to do. It's very easy to say that, but how do we actually get your dad out of jail is the first question. But actually, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be working in Egypt to try to encourage journalists, and there are some who want to change things, to try to work a bit harder to actually bring about change on the ground.
Thanks a lot, Mr. White. So thanks for the presentation. I think it was quite interesting to hear you about these important topics. Yes. Well, I hear you about the propaganda and propaganda information wars and so on, but I have also the impression that it's not only the bad, I don't know, the bad Russian, the bad Chinese, the bad Syrians, but also the bad West, who is making propaganda. Because I'm very surprised also to see networks which was very reputed, like CNN, who are also making a kind of propaganda now. So I think this problem is general, is not only related or focused to maybe some countries can. I come from a trip to Middle East, and I was also a supporter from Al Jazeera, but I hear a lot of critics about Al Jazeera in Arabic, especially in Arabic language, saying, yes, they are making propaganda and hatred speech. I don't know because I don't speak Arabic, so, but I was reported that. So for me, the problem seems to be more deeper and more important than I have known all these past decades, if I can say.
Yeah, absolutely. Look,
But,
I don't make the mistake of saying, I never make the mistake of saying there is a model of journalism which is the best.
Yeah.
There isn't.
It doesn't exist.
Because actually what there is there are people striving in different conditions to practice journalism. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. So, for example, after 9/11 in the United States, the media in the United States, almost all of the media, collapsed in terms of their ability to analyze why the 9/11 attacks took place. Because they coalesced around a defense of national security. They became very, very sort of, there wasn't any equivalization. They didn't say, oh, 9/11 occurred because of American foreign policy in the Middle East. They weren't allowed to say that for months afterwards because the circumstances dictated that the journalism had to work in a different way. I think one of the issues which we haven't touched on, it's a different meeting and it's a different process, is that, of course, there are criticisms that can be made about the media, but one of the biggest changes that's taken place, which actually has undermined public trust, is the way that social networks have drained journalism of capacity and resources to do journalistic work. Media all around the world are in big trouble. They don't have money to pay for investigative journalism. They don't have money to pay for training. And why is it? Because the social networks have developed a new business model which has drained journalism. And in so doing, they have not introduced a complete new principle of trusted information sources. Indeed, the business model for the social networks has been such that it has undermined people's capacity to get access to reliable and trustworthy information. And that's because the social networks have always seen streams of information, propaganda, pornography, extremism from terrorists, and journalism, all on the same level.
Small but concentrated chunks.
All small but concentrated chunks, of which the only important thing to think about is who's clicking, which is most popular. And so consequently, what we have seen is a devaluing of public information, whether it's academic research or journalism or public information. So that devaluing of public information has inevitably weakened journalism in its capacity to do good things, but also actually it's created a real vacuum in terms of public trust. And that seems to me probably one of the greatest challenges that we somehow got to face, and I don't know how we deal with that.
Mrs. Triumphi and Mrs. Triumphi.
Sure. No, I mean,
I
I fully agree with what Aidan just said, but if I may add to that, I think that your critique is absolutely fair and is one where organizations like ours have certainly looked a lot into as we look for the possibility and strategies to develop quality journalism. However, I think that we need to make a difference and not throw everything in the same pot. There is something which are media bias, which can be caused by many different reasons. It can be political pressure, can be economic pressure, can be just simply the bias typical to the journalistic activity. There is something that goes beyond that, which is a breach of the rule of law, which is a breach of the fundamental legal principles that we can certainly criticize Al Jazeera as well as CNN as well as any other news organization for the type of coverage they do, and let's do so absolutely. But then let's see how far their ability to cover events and express ideas, information, and opinion in a certain way is allowed to go. And I believe, and on that, there are laws, there are international principles that regulate all that. So if we say, what CNN is doing is propaganda, are there laws against propaganda? If so, what are those? Or are we going to use laws related to, I don't know, defamation, to national security, to anything else to judge CNN's coverage of certain events? Same with any other news. And for me, that is a very important difference. Yes, let's criticize news organizations, but also let's keep the legal boundaries in mind. There is something that is journalism and can be better quality or less good quality journalism, and there is something that is keeping a person so far proven innocent for 2.5 years in prison, and that has nothing to do with all of that. So yeah.
Okay, no,
Thanks.
Regarding the propaganda, I'm not a media expert. I'm just playing the consumer part of the media. I would agree that yes, there is no such thing as a news outlet that's totally 100% unbiased. Sure. There is always a source of bias. It might just come from the human element. I mean, even in science, I'm doing science, and sometimes we have these biases as just the differences between a human and other. But as let's say, as a part of a family that have witnessed this propaganda being played on us, we have been socially stigmatized as the sons of a terrorist, and actually the news outlet, they even broadcasted our names, our ages, information about us, where do we live. So it has threatened our life. That was a very dangerous thing for us. So I believe that there is a huge range of things that might fall in the range of propaganda, and putting someone's life in danger shouldn't be on the same balance as just mentioning something that's just biased because someone. Yeah,
well, I mentioned we have organized here an event to support free Al Jazeera journalists 4 years ago.
I remember.
Yeah. So but to mention it, I think it's an important topic. Absolutely. And not to have the full picture in mind. Yeah. Thanks, Boris.
Boris Engelson, a local freelance journalist who always thinks wrong. So I have shocking news for you first, is that while you were talking to each other, there were some outsiders in the room listening to your intimate confidences. So I have some reaction, but it is a deep nature of the media, especially the quality media, to speak for themselves and forget there is an outside world. So since you all agree with each other, it is my task, difficult task, to totally disagree with everything you said, especially on 4 counts. Don't misunderstand me. You are 3 or 4 heroes, whom we all deeply respect, and in that sense we are comrades in arms, which does not mean that we have to agree on everything. First point, there is an organization, it seems to be totally forgotten, I haven't heard a mention of it, called Reporters Sans Frontières. And Reporters Sans Frontières complains year after year that its audience, its impact is decreasing. And to make things worse, the founder of Reporters Sans Frontières has turned a hate speecher, a populist, Robert Ménard, to the point that Reporters Sans Frontières has never had the guts of inviting him to debate, while someone who was a leftist Democrat and creating this has become what he has. This is one first deep question. Second, I mean deep, my question is not deep, but I mean the problem is deep. Second, Mr. White, with whom I have sympathized and I think he's doing a very good job, may know or may not know that the 2 pictures from Vietnam he showed are very controversial. One, the naked girl, who was a symbol of the naughtiness, horror, inhumanity of the US nation and government, and who was embodying, especially naked, the resistant spirit of socialist-minded Vietnamese people, is now, if I am not mistaken, an evangelist in the United States, where she has been cured, etc. That's one thing. The other one, shot in the street, I heard a program on a public radio, this radio you revere so much, I think it was France Culture, where a journalist or photographer, French, made an investigation to try to trace the man who shot, and he discovered that, yes, that man shot, which is horrible. You don't have to shoot people without trial or even shoot them at all, but it was not a Viet Cong rebel, he was a criminal terrorizing the whole district. I don't know if it's true or not, but I can tell you that it is true that I heard a credible photographer, French photographer, who made that. So it shows how double-edged is our view of the world, even us quality media. I don't work for quality media, not too good for me. Third, I can't remember by heart the core value which you put forth, and I think we should think about that. But precisely these values, as far as I remember, were the very values which have been the cause of so much controversy in Switzerland during that campaign on public service media, and each side was sure that this value was running for them. So, you see, I could interpret your value as values of mourning for me that about the result of the ballot, you see. I personally voted against public media, television, but this is another debate. Okay, and the last point is that there are people, and this goes back to the first point, why Reporters Sans Frontières has always less following. There are people who think that we are in the year 1930s or in the year early year 1910. So it changed the whole context of what we can do, what we can't do, what is an urgent task, what is not, what is good journalism, what is bad journalism. So if really we are in something which is a mixture of 1913 and 1937, then of course it explains a lot of why we are paralyzed. So these were not to challenge or ridicule what you said, because I am very impressed by this group. And it is one of the press conferences I am happy to attend this year, and I hope we have a lot to share, but I don't want to hide or avoid what I consider unanswered issues.
I don't know if it was a comment, but if you wish to add something.
Well, I mean, I know those pictures very well. and I've followed them up and so on. And they're controversial in a number of ways. It's true that the person who was killed in the picture had just committed an atrocity further down the road. And he had killed a number of South Vietnamese soldiers. And that's why he was summarily executed. There is a backstory. This wasn't...
I never told that.
No. But what I'm saying is, of course, there's a backstory. And there's a backstory about the napalm picture, of course. Of course there is. But the point I was trying to make is this. That is there a public interest in the publication of such pictures? And if there is to be a decision about the public interest in the publication of those pictures, who is going to decide whether or not they should be published? And the reason why those pictures are important is because they contributed to a very simple and important debate taking place in the United States at that time, which was around the question, why are we in this war? Because those pictures are representative of the brutality of war and the nature of war. The question about where does this person come from, that person come from, is another matter. And academics can research it and debate it as long as they want. The journalistic question is, what do the public need to know? What can we contribute to their understanding of the major question? And that's what these brave journalists who took the decision to publish these pictures were doing, was that they were saying, this matter needs to be debated. This matter needs to be out in public. In another age, another time, they would not have published them. So, and what I'm saying here is, in order to have information before you which is relevant, reliable, contributes to your understanding of what's going on, you need journalists. And you need journalists with the freedom to take those sorts of decisions. And if you haven't got journalists to take those sorts of decisions, you can't rely on robots, you can't rely on propagandists, and you certainly can't rely on your politicians or your generals to take the decision for you. So that's the whole point about it. It's not an argument about this picture against that picture and so on. It's about the need for society to give journalists the space, the professional space and the freedom to make those choices. And then that's what we're losing. And I think this is why it's relevant.
So, you wish to add something, Mrs. Barbara?
Maybe just a comment. I'm not sure if I understood your last point fully. You mentioned some people feel that they're still in the year 1930, 1937, and
We are going towards war.
Yeah. I know what you mean. But if I may pick up on that, and it's true. I mean, there is this fears being spread and being used for political purposes. But if I may go back to that, what my concern is, the difference between today and 1930 is that today there is a world order that was created after the Second World War, and is a world order based on values that are underlying all these organizations which are around here, all the UN system and all that. And my impression is, and these are the values that are certainly also part at the foundation of an organization like IPI, funded in the year 1950 to promote good journalism, because the editors that created it believed that good journalism is the type of journalism that drives society towards peace, and this is part of our constitution. So it's that world order is crumbling at the moment, and these values. For the perception is that many of these values, for a lot of people, are felt as empty values. So what we are, maybe some of us on this panel, certainly myself, in my idealism, if you want, is to try and bring it back, because I don't think that they're dead and gone forever. I still believe that these are the values that should be supporting the societies we live in, and the fears that are being disseminated should not make us believe that these values are not important anymore. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that to strengthen, what is the underlying purpose of still believing that quality, ethical journalism is really important. So yeah.
Thanks. I don't know. Questions, maybe. Last one before concluding this debate. it's to come back to the topic in the Middle East. With your experience, you are maybe younger journalist, as I was told, but what is your feeling about Middle East after the so-called Arab Springs and so on? Did we have progress in terms of journalism and quality journalism in Middle East or not? What is your feeling about that? Or not a progress, the contrary, a regression, because we have seen.
Well, I mean, unfortunately.
Generally speaking, we have the.
Generally, there's been a regression.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's we see, and one of the tragedies that for your father is that he's become a proxy victim of a regional conflict in which Egypt has particularly targeted Al Jazeera as part of its attack on Qatar.
It's true.
So, in fact, your father is a classic example of someone who is caught up in this regional conflict. And that sectarianism, which is tearing apart the Middle East now, is really dangerous. And I think this is really something that we have to be really very concerned about. So the struggle for journalism is only part of a sort of political struggle for openness and reform. And just as we had with the Arab Spring when it began in Tunisia and it spread and it was fantastically inspirational, we have to somehow get back to that. And we have moved a long way away from it. So it would be wrong to have false optimism. I mean, I think we are in the midst of a very difficult, unstable period. And I think what we have to do is we just have to try to encourage much more solidarity between journalists to get a better understanding of why we need reliable streams of information, why we need to sort of support journalism and so on. And it's not easy. But in the Middle East, it's very worrying. It is very worrying, and I think the situation with Iran, for example, and the hostilities that's being built up there, the continuing sort of occupation of the Palestinian territories, the absolute refusal to sort of move towards a negotiated settlement there, all of this, I mean, I reflect on it, it's worse than I've ever known, and I'm an optimist. Okay. So, you know,
okay,
it's very difficult.
Conclusion and a way for working. Barbara, maybe.
Thank you. As much as I wish I could end on a positive note, I also fear that we have certainly seen a regression. We have seen things getting worse, as I said in the beginning. But you know, we keep one good example, Tunisia. Tunisia is getting better. Tunisia, we can learn from it a lot. But nevertheless, the last thing we should do is consider that all of this is a lost cause. There are brave, immensely brave voices, individuals in each single one of these countries, and for how weak they may appear at the moment, these are the people that certainly the International Press Institute, the Ethical Journalism Network, and all of us support and keep some type of discourse alive. So we are back in situations where, you know, every individual counts, and that's the work we're doing.
Thanks, Zara. Okay.
Having been there in the middle of the Egyptian revolution, where my dad was covering the revolution from the Tahrir Square, when I look back, I feel a lot of pain, because back then we had so much hope that everything was just going to be so right. Back then, we saw that this is a freedom that we want. Everyone was just free to post whatever they want on Facebook. News and resources were shared freely. But I confirm that there never has been such regression as what's happening now, and especially in Egypt. What's being manipulated, the news that's being spread are very restricted. But as Barbara said, I mean, this is just part of the trap. The way to democracy must be so hard. And actually the European experience of getting democracy, it wasn't that easy. So hopefully this is just the pathway that the country sadly has to take to get democracy.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for these comments. It's not yes, optimistic, but anyway, I think what is important in journalists is to be a realist and to see the things as they are, as not as we wish to. So thanks again for these comments, and I think it's not the last time we will speak about this.
Certainly not.
This topic. Hope
Sadly not.
yes. Hope all the best. And so thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Very
very
good.
much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well done.